Have you ever noticed how schools seem to market themselves these days? With the open days, the glossy brochures, all the focus on league tables, it feels less like a public service and a lot more like a business, right? Well, today we're going to dive into exactly why that is in this explainer on the Marketisation of UK Education.
I mean, it's a pretty familiar sight, isn't it? The brochures, the open days, that relentless focus on exam results. This didn't just happen by accident. Nope, it's actually the result of some very specific policies designed to make schools compete with each other. So let's unpack how we got here.
Right. So what is the big idea behind running a school like a business? Well, there's a single word that captures this whole concept, a word that has completely reshaped education as we know it in the UK.
And that word is marketisation. At its heart, it's all about bringing the forces of the market, things like competition and consumer choice, into the world of education. Now, the official goal was to drive up standards for everybody. But as we're about to see, whether it actually pulled that off is a massive point of debate.
And you can really break it down into these three core pillars. First, you give schools more independence, so they act almost like their own separate businesses. This naturally fires up competition because now their funding is tied directly to how many students they can attract. And that, in turn, is supposed to give parents choice, positioning them as savvy consumers in this new education marketplace.
Now, this change didn't just happen overnight. It was all kicked off by one huge landmark piece of legislation that really was a major turning point. Let's take a look at the moment this whole thing began.
And this timeline just shows the shift so clearly. Before 1988, the big idea was mainly about equal opportunities for all. But then came the 1998 Education Reform Act. It was driven by what's called New Right ideology, which is all about free markets and less state control. And it just flipped the script entirely. This was the moment the era of market-driven education really kicked off.
So think about it. If you want to create a marketplace, you need a couple of things, right? You need information for the consumers, and you need a standardized product. Well, the 1988 Act delivered both. League tables and Ofsted inspections gave parents the information, while the brand new national curriculum standardized what was being taught. This was the toolkit designed to get that competition going.
But why? Why go to all this trouble? Well, behind this massive overhaul was a really powerful and, honestly, optimistic theory. So, what was the big promise of all this competition?
The core belief, coming from those new right thinkers, was actually pretty simple. When schools are forced to compete for students, they'll also be forced to improve. It's just like any other market, really. The best will thrive, and the weaker schools will either have to get better or risk failing. You could almost call it educational survival of the fittest.
And on paper, the promised benefits sounded fantastic. The whole theory was that this new competitive spirit would naturally raise standards, make schools way more efficient with their money, lead to a whole bunch of different types of schools to choose from, and, most importantly, put the power right into the hands of parents.
But of course, that's the theory. It wasn't long before sociologists started to question the reality of it all. They began asking a really crucial question. Who was this new market actually for? Because let's be honest, while the idea of parental choice sounds perfectly fair and equal, the reality on the ground is way more complicated. The key question sociologists started asking was this: did every consumer in this new market really have the same amount of power?
And this brings us to a huge criticism, especially from sociologists like Stephen Ball. This idea of a parentocracy, where every parent has equal power, is pretty much a myth. As you can see here, middle-class parents can often use their capital, and that's not just money, but their knowledge of the system, their social connections, to get their kids into the best schools. For a lot of working-class parents, those choices just aren't really there. And this creates some serious unintended consequences. Critics point to something called cream skimming, where the top schools pick the most able students to keep their league table rankings high. That, in turn, can trap other schools in a cycle of decline. If you lose students, you lose funding, which makes it almost impossible to improve. And of course, all that pressure from league tables often leads to teaching to the test, where the curriculum gets really narrow, focusing only on what's being examined, instead on deep learning.
So, the really crucial point here is that the whole market analogy might be flawed right from the start. I mean, unlike a real market, you don't directly pay school fees, and your choices are often massively limited by where you can actually afford to live. This just fundamentally restricts genuine free choice for so many families. Okay, so After weighing the promise against the reality, what's the final verdict? What's the final grade on the marketization of education? Let's put it all together.
This scorecard really sums it all up perfectly. On one side, you have the supporters who argue that yes, competition works, it raises standards, and it empowers parents. But on the other side, you have the sociologists arguing that it actually makes inequality between schools worse. That parental choice is a myth for many, and then it creates a system that's just obsessed with exam results instead of real learning.
And that leaves us with this one final, vital question to think about. By turning our education system into a competitive marketplace, we really have to ask ourselves, who is ultimately winning in the system and who is being left behind?